Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
This podcast episode of Cut the Crop from the 2023 FAR Conference is from Christopher Preston from the University of Adelaide, who presents on herbicide resistance and the lessons New Zealand growers can take from the Australians.
I want to talk about where herbicide resistance is in Australia and what Australian farmers are doing about that. And perhaps you'll get a bit of a sense of what the opportunities are in New Zealand. And I'm going to make, if you don't want to listen to the rest of my talk, I'm going to give you the final bits right up front. So, what has resistance done to Australian farming? Australian farmers are still profitable. And if you go and talk to Australian farmers, they will tell you that weed resistance has made them better farmers. However, weed resistance has made weed management far more complicated. So that's the downside. Right, we have 52 different weed species in Australia that have herbicide resistance, and that covers almost all of the herbicides we have available for grain production. So pretty much for every herbicide we have at least one weed that's got resistance. But our biggest and by far and away our most difficult problem has been annual ryegrass. And we tended to focus a lot on how to get on top of annual ryegrass because it is the biggest issue. So I've got a map up here of that big island to the west. This map actually shows our weed resistance surveys that we did. So I've been doing this for 25 years in Australia in the south, and in 2019 we, all the people who are doing these got together and had this great idea. We were going to survey the whole of the grain production system all at once using the same methodology, test everything using the same methodology so we could compare everything. Brilliant idea, except for the fact that we planned to do it in the summer of 2020, 2021. When the place was locked down with COVID, every border in Australia was closed and we had to somehow get this survey done. The dots on that map are where we surveyed. The blue dots are where we found ryegrass. So there were around about 1,700 farmers' fields that we sampled. We had to get permission from every farmer to do that. And we found ryegrass in over 1,300 of those fields. So this is across the country. So what did we find? Well, we found resistance. So this is resistance to our post-emergent chemistry that we use. So we've got the group 1, which are our grass-selective herbicides, and it doesn't matter which state in Australia you go to, panoxidine does not control ryegrass anymore. We get a bit more activity out of clethodim. Clethodim still has some activity, but the way farmers are using it, and it's quite a complex discussion, the way farmers use it mean that it's actually not as useful as our survey tells us. So we could use it better. Moving to the group 2 chemistry, the sulfonylureas, no, they don't work anywhere at all. And even the imidazolino chemistry, which we've only had for a short period of time in Australia, no longer works on ryegrass. Glyphosate. We've had glyphosate resistance for a long time in Australia, but it's now really starting to get very, very widespread. So across the country, 16, so that's 1 in 6 farmers' fields have glyphosate-resistant ryegrass in them. The only of the post-emergent products that works reliably is paraquat. We're using a lot more paraquat now. So that's post-emergent herbicides. We also tested pre-emergent herbicides. And this is the range of pre-emergent herbicide chemistry we had. So we've got trifluralin, group 3, we've got some group 15s, we've got some of our newer products we're using, pyroxasulfone, simethylin, bixlozone. And the only one that we have a lot of resistance in is trifluralin, and that tends to be concentrated in South Australia and Victoria. Of the others, there's resistance out there, but it's at really low levels. So one of the things that Australian farmers do to manage ryegrass is they rely on pre-emergent herbicides. But we don't use pre-emergent herbicides like we used to. We use them in entirely different ways. So if your idea of how pre-emergent chemistry for grasses worked is what we did in the 90s and the 80s, that's not what Australian farmers do now. It's entirely different. But it's also driven the type of seeding systems that they use. So the chemistry and control of ryegrass is actually driving other parts of the farming system. So what we're doing is we're using mixtures and sequences of pre-emergent chemistry to get over the line with ryegrass control. Once upon a time, when I started working on weeds, if you got 70 or even 80% control with a pre-emergent herbicide, you thought that was a pretty good job. Our farmers are not happy unless they're getting over 95% control with their pre-emergent herbicides. So we've shifted that game. We've gone from a product like trifluridin here, maybe giving us a 70% control, to looking at over there, we've got peroxysulfone plus triolate as a mixture, and that'll give us reliably 95% control of ryegrass. We've got other practices that can get us to 99. So that's what we're aiming for. We're trying to do it, at least in our cereals, entirely with pre-emergent chemistry as our only chemistry. Everything else are add-ons. And this is one of them. This is a freebie, and we've finally learned how to use it. It's called crop competition. It doesn't actually kill any weeds, but what it does is it reduces the seed set by up to 50%. Weed control is not a, I've got a weed this year, what do I do about it? Task in Australia. Weed control is a long-haul job. Farmers are thinking about, how do I actually control my weeds over the next 5 to 10 years? What am I going to do this year that's going to help me next year, that's going to help me the year after that? And this is one of those tools. And one of the ways we're doing it with wheat is we're simply sowing early. So those are two photographs out of a trial that I ran. Sown at the beginning of May versus sown at the beginning of June. They have exactly the same ryegrass population in them. The early sown, you can't see the ryegrass because it's all under the canopy. The late sown, that's full of ryegrass. 50% seed set reduction. That's half the weed seeds you're going to have next year. So that's one of the tools. Crop rotations. We're changing our crop rotations. We're stacking tactics. I'll say it's no longer just about chemistry. It's about all the other things you can do. And we've got a few different things we're doing. What I've got here is actually one of the really unusual things that we've managed to do in Australia, and this is a 9-year-long integrated management trial for weeds. Now, it's really hard to get funding to do a 9-year trial, and it's really hard to get a farmer who's going to let you have a trial on his land for 9 years. And we would have had this for longer, except the farm changed hands and the new farmer wanted a grey sheep. So this came about because this was actually a farming systems group's field day site. And I ran a trial with them on some of the pre-emergent chemistry we're doing, and they decided to put in some post-emergent herbicides just to show that, you didn't need to get into this pre-emergent chemistry too soon. And what their post-emergent trial showed was that the whole site was overrun with resistant ryegrass. And so the manager called me up and said, Chris, he says, I got this trial site, we're leaving it, we can't run it, I want you to use it as a weed management trial. So we set out to do it. Along the bottom I got the crops, wheat, barley, canola and wheat. That's the kind of typical crops that were grown in the area. This is at Lake Bolac in southern Victoria. And we're measuring seed heads at the end of the season. This is not what's in the crop at the beginning of the season. This is what is there at harvest. This tells us what we're going to have next year. And I've got 3 strategies there called low, medium and high. They're the cost structures. So low cost was what the farmer was doing. Medium was what the agronomist thought the farmer should be doing. And high was whatever Chris Preston could think up to put in. And what we saw was over the first few years that, weed numbers were going up and up and up. Notice that that's on the thousands on the left-hand side, and each one of those ryegrass seed heads would have 30 seeds in it, so big seed populations. So John Midwood, who was running Southern Farming Systems at the time, called me up and said, Chris, he says, we're going at it backwards here. We've got to do something different. What are we going to do? And I said, we need another crop. We can't get away with just wheat, barley and canola. It's not working. We need another crop. He said, what are we going to grow? And I said, faba beans. And John goes, nobody here grows failure beans. So we grew failure beans. That's the FB, faba beans. And it's a bit, numbers went out off the scale, because 2016 was a really wet spring for us in summer. But that's a bit deceptive, because we have a practice we call crop topping, where we spray faba beans late in the season with paraquat to kill ryegrass seeds. So all the seed heads were there, they had no seed in them. And then in the next year, I convinced them we're going to put canola and not a cereal in. And the reason we were going to put a canola in was I lived in South Australia and we weren't allowed to play with Roundup Ready canola, and I wanted to have a play. But mostly I wanted to have a second go. So we put Roundup Ready canola in, and we crop topped it again, and we came out the back of that with virtually no ryegrass. And what you can see is where we've gone for the low-cost strategy, ryegrass is going up again. Where we've gone for the higher-cost strategy, we're keeping the numbers even. So, double breaks. 2 crops in a row where we can really get on top of the weeds. Stacking tactics, the high-cost strategy, all come into play here. Which of those was the most profitable rotation over those 9 years? It was the high-cost strategy was the most profitable. That generated over $1,000 per hectare gross margin compared to the low strategy over those 9 years, and it was about $300 per hectare better than the medium. So one of the messages is that if you think you're spending too much on weed control, you're probably not. There's space to spend more, do it right, and make more profit. Some other things we're doing is, this is starting to become really big. It's a thing called harvest weed seed control. It's a mechanical practice to try and reduce the amount of seed that goes back into the seed bank. And we're working on trying to get every farmer in Australia doing some of this. And there's a range of practices that we have. The top on your left is a thing called a chaff cart. If you've got stock, they're okay, because the stock will eat all the chaff. If you don't have stock, they're a pain. So not very many of those. On the top on the right was what people got into when they decided they didn't like chaff carts, which is a thing called windrow burning, where you'd have narrow windrows and you'd burn them the next year. Great if you happen to farm at Geraldton. Doesn't work too well anywhere else in the country because you can't get permits to burn early enough. It's been disadopted. Hardly anybody's doing that. On the bottom left, we have a thing called a chaff deck. It takes the chaff fraction containing the weed seeds and it puts it on the wheel tracks in controlled traffic situations. We've got a version if you don't have controlled traffic as well, and you just run over that weed seed. And what you're doing is you bring all your weed seeds and you put them in a single spot in your crop. So it's not competing with your whole crop, it's just competing with a bit of a crop. And then there's the ultimate on the bottom right, which are the seed mills, okay, where the material goes through a mill and all the seeds are damaged. We're getting farmers to adopt those. Maybe there's some new alternatives. I hear a lot of stuff about some new mechanical options going on. We've got electrocution of weeds up the top there. There are lasers, even microwave weed control. They all sound like they're going to be really good and really brilliant. Issue with all of these is that their travel speed runs somewhere between 1 and 3 kilometres an hour. They're not going to do your primary weed control, but we're looking at them. Can we introduce these to do that next bit of weed control? So we put our chemistry out and we want to get the survivors. So is this the opportunity for us? Maybe it is. But it's going to require robots. We're not going to get people to drive at 3 kilometres an hour on a tractor. Nobody likes driving that long. And finally, and probably most importantly, is having a clear, consistent message to growers about the tactics that they should be thinking about using it. So we have a program called Weed Smart. It involves about half the chemical companies that sell chemistry in Australia. It involves some of the companies that sell mechanical operations, and it involves some academics like me. And the aim of that is to try and come up with messages for farmers, examples for farmers, so that they have a clear, consistent message about what they should be doing, and they've got examples about how to do it. So we have a lot of farmer champions who are already doing this. We get them up to talk about how to do these things. We've got a thing called the Big Six. These are the things we want farmers to focus on for weed control. So I'm going to finish there, and thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.